As I've mentioned already, the theme of our two-day symposium is religious and political disagreement. The symposium addresses issues of religious and political disagreement as they play out in 4 different contexts. 1, disagreement among the world religions and secular worldviews in pluralistic and globalized societies, a topic addressed by Professor Wolf yesterday afternoon. 2, disagreement among evangelical Christians, a topic addressed by Professor Black last evening. 3, disagreement marking the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a matter addressed just now by Dr. Raheb in an earlier lecture. And 4, disagreement within the Christian community as a whole, a subject to be addressed by our next speaker, Professor Robert Benne. And to introduce Professor Benne and to moderate the rest of our session, I call now upon Professor Jamie Schillinger, our very fine chair of the Religion Department at St. Olaf College.
Thanks very much. Robert Benne is the Jordan-Trexler Professor of Religion, Emeritus, and Research Associate in the Religion and Philosophy Department of Roanoke College in Salem, Virginia. He teaches Christian ethics for the online Lutheran Institute for Theology. In 1982, he founded the Roanoke College Center for Religion and Society, which the college named in his honor in 2013. He was the Jordan-Trexler Professor of Religion and Chair of the Religion and Philosophy Department at Roanoke College for 18 years. Before that, he was a professor of Church and Society at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago for 17 years. A native of Nebraska and a graduate of Midland University, his graduate degrees are from the University of Chicago. He's lectured and written widely on the relation of Christianity and culture. A recent book was titled Good and Bad Ways to Think About Religion and Politics. No wonder he was invited. In 2017, Erdman's will publish his account of Roanoke College's relation to its Lutheran heritage in a book tentatively titled The Quest for Soul at Roanoke College, Learnings from its 175-year venture in Christian higher education. That book builds on an earlier book of his entitled Quality with Soul, How 6 Premier Colleges and Universities Keep Faith with Their Religious Traditions, published in 2001. One of those 6 premier institutions was St. Olaf College. And Robert Benne's analysis in that book remains valuable for thinking about the challenges of institutions who wish to keep faith. Professor Benne's work in books like Defining America, A Christian Critique of the American Dream, and The Paradoxical Vision, A Public Theology for the 21st Century, have been extremely important contributions to the public discussion of religion and politics in the American context from a Lutheran perspective. His thought has drawn on traditional Lutheran concerns, the much debated and oft revised Two Kingdoms theory, the distinction between law and gospel, and the significance of thinkers like Reinhold Niebuhr. In his analysis of these challenges and central premises of the Lutheran tradition, Professor Benne has attempted to chart a course between political quietism that has sometimes characterized Lutheranism in the past, and the sorts of liberal political activism of the social gospel variety that, some would say, dilutes the distinctiveness of Christian witness and promise. I've struggled and been challenged by Professor Benne's writings in the past. He is not one to shy away from controversial statements. Professor Benne's work certainly merits energetic and critical engagement, and in anticipation of a lively discussion, I welcome Professor Benne and his lecture, Trying to Live as a Christian in a Polarized Church and Society.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I admire your endurance, all of you up there. And I'm going to test it heavily by my talk, which I'm now 17 minutes late, so we're going to go a little bit further. That's okay. No, I understand running a conference like this. Good to be back at St. Olaf. I've been here many times over the years, and still admire its commitment to keeping its soul alive, its Lutheran soul alive, and it seems to me that it's still around kicking, so I'm pleased about that. What I'm going to do is have three different sections to my talk. One, our polarized situation, trying to understand where we are in this American society at this time, including its religious dimension. Secondly, perhaps more controversially, trying to live as a Christian in a polarized church and in a splitting church. And thirdly, how the church should try to live in a polarized political situation. Those are big topics, and I will take them on as best I can. Actually, I should add to the title Christian teacher, because that's what I was called to do from a pretty early age. And so I'm looking upon this as somebody that trying to be a Christian teacher in a polarized church and society. Coming Apart, that influential book by Charles Murray, yes, that Charles Murray, analyzes the increasing division between the educated classes and the white working and lower classes, and the grim features of life among the latter. But I take the phrase more generally as descriptive of the overall trajectory of life in America in my lifetime. Let me explain. I was born in a year with one of the lowest birth rates on record, 1937, and came of age in the late 1940s and 50s. I went to graduate school from 1960 to 65, years that were really an extension of the 50s. Those formative years were characterized by a rare coherence in American life, the smooth operation of what Robert Benne called the Republican and biblical traditions provided the cultural guidance system of American life. Politically, it made the differences between Republicans and Democrats barely discernible. Economic growth lifted all boats and offered the promise of social mobility for everyone. Culturally, the Judeo-Christian ethic was deeply embedded in the code of conduct. Churches did not have to teach the Christian worldview on marriage and sexual ethics. It would have been shocking for anyone even to use the word sex at Grace Lutheran Church in West Point, Nebraska, but we all knew what was right. No sex before marriage, children only after marriage, and marriage is permanent. Even that fine Lutheran singer Frank Sinatra sang, "Love and marriage, they go together like a horse and carriage." Whole families enjoyed the same pop music. Of course, it was not a perfect time. Women's were limited by sharply defined gender roles. Blacks suffered under racism and segregation. Gays and lesbians had to stay in the closet. But nearly everyone I know, including the women of my generation, thought it was a wonderful time to grow up. All sorts of paeans to the 50s circulate the internet, gobbled up by my contemporaries, those who use computers but resist iPhones. Indeed, we engaged in the liberal idealism of the early 60s, my graduate school years, when the civil rights, anti-poverty, and community organization movements promised to address some of the underlying problems of American life. After the shocking assassination of John Kennedy in 1963, Lyndon Johnson passed through his vigorous Great Society policies to aid those movements. All that was shattered by the upheaval of the 60s, which I believe was the decade from 1965 to 75. The divisive and tragic Vietnam War provided the occasion for the rise of radical politics and economics, but the most lasting upheaval was in cultural life. The rise of feminism, multiculturalism, the gay and lesbian movement, nascent environmentalism, black power, and anti-imperialism all emerged with vigor in the 60s. The election of Richard Nixon soon quelled political radicalism and recession. And a recession, one happened in the early 70s, always prompts leaders to grow the economy rather than to redistribute its rewards. But the Cultural Revolution was unstoppable. Parents could no longer listen to the same music as their kids. In fact, I thought that when Elvis sang "You Ain't Nothing for a Hound Dog," that kind of marked the beginning of the end of Western civilization. There were many gains from these movements, certainly, but as each nascent initiative burrowed its way into American society, division and later polarization ensued. Over the decades following, what Martin Marty called the culture was dispersed into subcultures. The biblical Republican guidance system was fractured. Add to that economic dynamics that rewarded the highly educated technocratic classes and punished the working classes, and you have a formula for increased polarization and the election of Donald Trump. Both the successful, highly educated and the descending working classes slowly distanced themselves from religious involvement. The nones, N-O-N-E-S, increased dramatically. The highly educated, now secular progressives, making up about 20% of the population, take over the commanding heights of the culture, education in general, but higher education in particular. Government bureaucracies, entertainment, the media, news, and now even sports. They accentuate identity politics and call for inclusion and diversity. They embrace feminism, abortion, environmentalism, multiculturalism, anti-imperialism, and the LGBTQ agenda. They enlist the power of large organizations and other public organizations, such as the NCAA and the NBA, who are terrified that they might be viewed as intolerant or exclusive. They distrust classic Christianity for many reasons. It believes in revealed truth, for one thing, but mainly because of its qualms, classic Christianity's qualms about the sexual revolution, which is now pressing for transgenderism after winning its battle on the right to marry for gays and lesbians. The secular progressives want religion confined to private life. They tend toward the Democratic Party 4-1. The economic and cultural losers, the white lower and middle classes, turn to populist politics as the only instrument they have to fight back. They become avid Trumpsters. But a portion of them also distance themselves from Christianity and are tempted toward white nationalism. But most of all, many of the losing classes suffer from the loss of a marriage and family culture, and they descend into chaos. They assuage their pain by drugs and other self-destructive behavior. Black families suffer many of the same dysfunctions as the white lower classes, but they have hope for the expansion of the welfare state and continue to trust in the Democratic Party. What the University of Virginia Study of Family Cultures calls the faith culture, 20% of the American population, feels increasingly embattled in a culture dominated by secular progressives who want religiously based moral values, especially regarding sexual ethics, to get out of public life. The celebrated cases of florists and bakers punished for their recalcitrance in participating in ceremonies that violate their beliefs strike fear into their hearts. They want the freedom to exercise their religion publicly in their working lives and in their church-related institutions. Though the faithful, that 20%, had great ambivalence toward Donald Trump, some simply could not vote for him, the majority nevertheless did support him, and mainly because of his promise to nominate Supreme Court justices who will protect religious freedom. The faith culture, 20%, tends toward the Republican Party, 4-1. What about mainline Protestantism? All of them has suffered schism, which we will discuss later. Even after the schisms, they are divided at the grassroots level between the lingering faith culture and members who want to accommodate to the progressive culture. Denominational leadership beyond the parish continues to press the progressive agenda, which they believe is consistent with their faith. Pastors, now recognizing how fragile the situation is, try to avoid hot-button issues that will divide their congregations further. Even so, the mainline denominations experience a free fall. Mark Granquist has pointed out that even bracketing out those members lost to two new Lutheran denominations, the ELCA lost 1.2 million members. Part of that decline, of course, for all mainline denominations, must be attributed to the waning notion that to be an American means to be a Protestant, Catholic, or Jew. It is no longer fashionable to belong to a religious communion, especially for the highly educated. Indeed, given the cultural shifts mentioned above, it is slightly disreputable to be conventionally religious. Those who were once casual but friendly Christians have departed. The result is that they have morphed into secular progressives who resist any publicly relevant religion unless it supports the progressive agenda. In that case, liberal religion gets a free pass. Catholics would have registered a similar free fall without the influx of Hispanics to America. After a resurgence of classic Catholicism under two popes, John Paul II and Benedict XVI, Francis gives off mixed signals. Prominent Catholics in political roles accommodate to the secular progressive agenda. But there are many classic Catholics left in the church. They too voted for Trump for the same reasons the conservative Protestants did. Catholicism itself would be probably divided if it didn't have such a strong magisterial tradition. Catholics leave rather than try to start a new Catholic church. That's my take on the polarization of society. Now I move on to something some of us have painfully experienced, a polarized church and a polarized society. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America did not escape the polarizing trends set loose in the 60s and proceeding through the later decades. I thought its confessional tradition and its commitment to serious biblical and theological reflection might insulate it from those trends. I thought there were settled teachings on key issues that would weather the divisions that were plaguing the larger society. But all that was nullified by the unfolding formation of the ELCA. The centuries-long trend toward Lutheran unity was soon to be dramatically reversed into disunity. I will not address the conflict in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod that led to schism in the mid-70s. That's another story. Indeed, in many ways, the ELCA anticipated the changes that were soon to come upon the larger society. The new church early on built the spirit of the 60s right into its DNA. By the mid-80s, the Committee for a New Lutheran Church was heavily conditioned by the strong voices of feminism, black and gay liberation, multiculturalism, and anti-imperialism. They were successful in instituting a widely disliked quota system to empower the excluded. Blacks at 2% of the membership were represented at all committees at 10%. Women at 50%, and that at a time where there were not many women pastors. The planners marginalized bishops and theologians from any real power, viewing them as one more interest group that was under suspicion for its male dominance. They began transforming the language of worship, coming within 3 votes of banning the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit from the language of worship. They promised that this would be a really new church, and not like your father's church or your mother's church, and they succeeded in founding something pretty new in 1989. The new church elicited enough concern that 2 large call to faithfulness conferences were held on the campus of this college in the early 90s. Some of you may remember those. Attended by over 1,000 lay and clergy Lutherans. Organized by the 3 independent Lutheran journals, Lutheran Forum, Dialogue, and Lutheran Quarterly, they were shots across the bow of the ELCA. One editor quipped that the conferences were the only things that kept the ELCA from already becoming a united Church of Christ. It seems that the concerns that elicited the conferences were widely shared. Membership losses slowly increased in the 90s, averaging 12,500 a year. But the resistance only slowed liberationist themes in their march through the institutions. For conservative Lutherans, the annoyances continued to build up. Constant purging of the language of worship and theological speech from male pronouns and images, including also military images, a ministry to political actors morphing into advocacy offices whose preferences track closely with the politics of the left wing of the Democratic Party, including its distancing itself from the support for Israel. Its incredibly bad statement on sex in the early 90s, which had to be withdrawn, and its presiding bishop giving advice to politicians on every topic under the sun. But 2 moves in the late 90s provided to be the last straw for many Lutherans, so serious that they were church dividing, not just annoyances. One was the insistence of the ELCA that ordinations of Lutheran clergy had to be legitimated by the presence of episcopal bishops in the apostolic succession. Hidden under that hubbub was, over that move was an even more serious departure from Christian teaching, this time having to do with the Great Commission. The Board of Global Missions, fueled by the conviction that pioneer missionary work, pioneer meaning you're bringing the gospel to those peoples who have never heard it, was so contaminated by cultural and political imperialism that it moved to suspend all such pioneer mission work and confined itself to accompaniment, that is, helping already established churches at their bidding. The ELCA and Assembly confirmed both decisions. Those moves precipitated the departure of several hundred congregations who gathered into an association of congregations called Lutheran Congregations in Mission for Christ. It was birthed by an organization, an earlier one called Word Alone, which then went out of business when LCMC was formed. Losses of membership from 2001 to 2009 accelerated to 63,000 a year. A nagging issue that perplexed conservative Lutherans of all stripes was the refusal of the ELCA to teach a pro-life message or to participate in any pro-life movements or advocacy efforts. One of the crucial values, Christian values, deep respect for nascent life, that was characteristic of Christianity from its inception, was simply ignored by the national church and the synodical churches. From the beginning of the ELCA, activist groups, especially one called Lutherans Concerned, agitated for the moral acceptance of homosexual conduct, which would then lead to the blessing, soon to morph into marriage, of gay unions and the ordination of married gays. Their initiatives in due time found welcoming gestures by the bureaucracy of the ELCA, many of its bishops, and most of its seminaries and educational institutions, including St. Olaf. This alarmed a whole new contingent of classic Lutherans who formed resistance groups called Solid Rock and Lutheran Core, Lutheran Coalition for Reform. They built networks that impeded the move toward gay marriage and ordination in the assemblies of 2005, 2007. But the momentum of sexual liberation or marriage equality was relentless. The church-wide assembly of 2009 voted narrowly to accept a social statement on sexual ethics that was ambivalent about every issue under debate, and more decisively, however, that assembly decisively voted to bless gay unions and ordain married or partnered gays. It accepted the last two motions without any serious biblical or theological argument. Classic Christian teaching of thousands of years' duration was overturned by the vote of the church assembly. A rogue tornado struck the neighborhood of the assembly as it voted on these sexuality issues, knocking the steeple off a Lutheran church nearby. I leave the interpretation of that event to our latter-day prophets. That was the last straw for a larger group of Lutherans. In 2010 and 2011, an average of 241,000 Lutherans left per year, and over 700 congregations departed. The autumn after the 2009 decisions featured a meeting of more than 1,000 members of CORE, who then planned the birth of a new Lutheran denomination, the North American Lutheran Church, which was organized in the summer of 2010. It claims to be a centrist Lutheran body in America, bordered on one side by the conservative LCMS, Missouri Synod, and on the other by a liberal Protestant ELCA. Now at long last, we come to the question, what does it mean to try to live as a Christian teacher in a polarized and then splitting church? For my wife and me, it meant leaving the church, the ULCA, the LCA, and the ELCA, into which we were born. I had been deeply involved in the formation and work of both Solid Rock and CORE for their 4 years of formal organizational resistance, but had written and spoken in opposition to the general direction of the ELCA was taking since its inception. When all our efforts came to naught in the 2009 assembly, I felt a great sense of relief. I then felt free from continuing efforts to resist. Game over. My ambivalent membership in the ELCA was clarified. I joined the efforts to establish a new church and was soon elected to its Commission on Theology and Doctrine. A friend of mine, Carl Broughton, a St. Olaf graduate, and I organized a yearly Young Theologians Workshop with the intent of incubating a new generation of theologians for the North American Lutheran Church, as well as conducting a yearly theological conference on important issues that drew over 500 attendees. These lectures are now called, since both Carl and I have retired, the Broughton-Benne Lectures in Theology, and they precede the annual North American Lutheran Church convocations. So, we cast our lot with a new church. When a neighboring parish in Roanoke, we live in Southwest Virginia, became North American Lutheran Church, we left the church in Salem we belonged to for 33 years, though that church had kept its Orthodox teaching intact. We have deeply enjoyed our move to a large and flourishing parish, which defines itself as liturgical, sacramental, and orthodox. Right now, I am teaching an adult class on the historic Christian teaching on marriage and sexual ethics. It is wonderful to have our convictions match the stance of the local and national churches to which we belong. Integrity is an important virtue. Indeed, it is healthful for the soul to be for something, to build a future, rather than to be constantly in an oppositional stance. In our transition, we have tried to act as Christians in this divisive situation. Here are the principles we tried to follow. Leave a church, national and local, only when we and other thoughtful and mature Christians are convinced that core Christian teachings have been rejected. In this case, a crucial element of the Great Commission, as well as clear biblical and traditional teaching, Christian teaching on the nature of marriage. It made both faithful moves, the ELCA made both faithful moves without biblical and theological arguments that would have had to have been overwhelming in order to overturn centuries of settled Christian teaching. Of course, the ELCA doesn't see these departures as church dividing issues, but that seems empirically doubtful since over 1 million Lutherans have left, and theologically indispensable given my own reading of the role of marriage in the Christian tradition. It is not a second-order teaching. Number 2, exercise prudence in making our decision to leave. We could have agitated in our local parish for it to leave, and if successful, begin a movement within the synod, for more churches, perhaps the whole synod, to leave. But our judgment was that such action would be futile and result merely in bitter division. The bishop of the synod and members of his staff belong to our former parish, and the synod itself is permeated by a familial ethos in which belonging trumps believing. Agitation would have brought only conflict and loss. We decided to leave in peace. Number 3 principle, exercise patience and charity toward those who stayed. We wrote a letter of departure to our congregation with the reasons we were leaving and did not denounce the parish for their inaction. The pastor understood fully. We have kept our friendships intact, though there is little doubt that we share less with them. We worship there when our children and grandchildren have a part in the church services, but both of us feel, to our surprise, somewhat uncomfortable. We remain on cordial terms with the leadership of the synod, though we no longer participate in any of its functions. This patience and charity is reinforced by the continuing prospect that our decisions may have been wrong, in which case we ask the forgiveness of God and our opponents. Fourthly, we pray for a renewal and reform of the church, including the ELCA and the NALC, and pray constantly to examine our own conscience, and me particularly as a Christian teacher, and that of other teachers, that they may do the same before the biblical warning in James 3, verse 1, that, quote, "Not many of you should become teachers in the church, for we who teach will be judged more strictly." Third section, the church's role in a polarized political situation. A couple of years ago, I wrote the Lutheran chapter in a book edited by Amy Black, who probably is still here, called 5 Views on Church and Politics. Little did I know how relevant that book would be for the election of 2016. I taught it to a large class at our new parish last fall, aiming at concerted reflection on how Christians should think about the election. I supplemented that text with a little book mentioned earlier called Good and Bad Ways to Think About Religion and Politics. The course became very intense when it became clear that Donald Trump was the Republican candidate. In both books, I argue that Christians should not separate their core Christian convictions from their political judgments, nor should they fuse them, kind of a theme that's been going through this conference. There are those in the secular world who believe that Christians should drop their core beliefs when they enter the public sphere. I call them separationists. And they would like to try to intimidate conservative Christians from bringing their religiously based moral convictions into public life. And such kind of intimidation needs to be overcome by the courage of conservative Christians. But there are Christians who unthinkingly do not connect Sunday and Monday, do not connect their core Christian convictions and politics, And others who quite thinkingly claim that Christians cannot participate in worldly power, those are the sectarians and the neo-sectarians, or currently very popular, those who Christians should slowly withdraw, which is commended by Rod Dreher in the famous Benedict option that's being discussed. I argue that if God is sovereign over all, we must be obedient in all sectors of life, including politics. And of course, Luther believed that citizenship was a Christian calling. That means connecting faith and politics. But we should not fuse religion and politics. Religionized politics is quite dangerous to society, and politicized religion is even more dangerous, if not fatal, to the church. It domesticates the transcendent claims of the gospel and makes the church one more interest group, and it is treated that way by society and even by Christians. Witness the demise of the National Council of Churches when it fused Christianity too closely with a political position. A significant portion of conservative Christians now recognize the danger of fusion. Amy talked about that last evening. But many more plunge toward fusing faith and politics. The leadership of liberal Protestantism, interestingly enough, seems undisturbed by its commitment to the liberal political agenda, though its grassroots members are far more mixed. This reluctance to fuse religion and politics is also in line with the Lutheran teaching on the two ways that God reigns, the law and the gospel. Politics has to do with the order of creation, which is beholden to God's law, his left hand. It is not the realm of redemption, which is constituted by the gift of the gospel, the reign of God's right hand. To fuse politics and faith is to elevate human work in the order of creation as a replacement for the grace of God in Christ. Penultimate concerns are raised to the level of ultimacy, a formula for idolatry. Rather than separate or fuse religion and politics, we should engage in critical participation. We should be fully aware that the journey from core Christian convictions to political ideologies, parties, and judgments is a very complex and jagged one. There are few straight lines from core Christian convictions to political decisions. In coming to political judgment, one must transverse a number of stages. Which biblical principles are gathered, keying off those biblical ones, working through Christian social teachings, one's political philosophy, one's ordering of the principles of justice, one's reading of the situation, as well as the many impingements of one's social location, including such things as peer pressure, the region where you live, your parents' views on politics, temperament. All these things are accounted for. When they're all accounted for, it's difficult to brand any decision the Christian one. That is a good reason why we should refrain from having Christian political parties. Given all this, that complexity and jaggedness, we as individual Christians should cut each other a lot of slack in the realm of politics. Even more reluctance should characterize churches. They should rarely support specific parties or legislation. So engage our Christian convictions, but be aware that with each step, from core to policy, Christians of goodwill and intelligence part company. It's a complex process. This hesitance to claim Christian sanction for political parties and policies is qualified in two ways. Sometimes, and we need the help of the Holy Spirit to discern this, there are parties and policies so wicked that Christians simply must resist, refuse participation, and actively defy. In retrospect, we can see that Bonhoeffer and the Confessing Church were right. Nazism was that wicked. But those two parties, Bonhoeffer and the Confessing Church, were a small minority. Other good Germans were swept away. What policies now would rise to that level of wickedness that would bring defiance and active resistance? Historically, in America, we fought a very painful civil war when the federal government, energized by Christian anti-slavery societies, put down the Confederacy. But what would lead to such level of wickedness now? Big question. But the second qualification is this. Christians of a reasonably orthodox sort ought to be able to move together on three fronts: the protection of religious liberty, which includes the free exercise of religion, the protection of nascent life, and a safety net for those who cannot take care of themselves. Those are merely general directions. There would be much disagreement over exactly what sort of policies would achieve those goals, yet those directions should resonate with all Christians. Back to the election of 2016. After teaching these themes in my Sunday school class, the jaggedness, the complexity of moving from core Christian beliefs to political decisions, we proceeded to discuss this very unusual election. My emphasis also for not confusing ultimate issues with penultimate issues. Those were the background that I had taught. The class was unhappy that they had to choose between a Clinton Democratic dynasty and a Trump populist insurgency, especially when Trump was such a controversial character. As the election neared, I had the class list reasons for 1, voting for Hillary, 2, voting for Donald, 3, not voting, 4, voting for a third party or write-in candidate. It was a very wholesome process to go through this exercise because it showed that people could actually give reasons for voting for a candidate whom others thought was beyond the pale. The next Sunday, I asked if anyone had the courage to tell the rest of the class how they were going to vote and why. A number of people in the class divulged their choices. I thought that was marvelous, to have the guts to do that, but also the serenity of the group to accept that. I had done enough Lutheran teaching that thoughtful Christians, even though on different sides politically, could respect and calmly disagree in a politically polarized society. Our class, even though theologically conservative, was all over the place politically. The majority still in the painfully undecided camp. They couldn't stand Trump's character. Yet all were engaging their Christian convictions in a very painful way in their political choices. No one expected Trump to win. So the Sunday following the election was one of intense reflection. By then it was clear that many Christians, led by evangelicals of over 88%, although Amy qualified that, the 80% had voted for Trump because of the promise he made to appoint Supreme Court justices that would honor religious liberty and would not be a zealot for the abortion cause. If there were a majority in the class who finally voted for Trump, which I think there was, it was for those reasons. The abortion issue and especially the religious liberty issue. No one in the class thought that Trump was a serious Christian or a man of virtue or character. I was proud of how that class unfolded because it was clear that Christians could hold together with love and respect in a highly polarized political situation. I do not think that could have happened. I don't think politics could have been discussed so candidly in a church that was seriously divided theologically. That is, religious solidarity enabled us, and clarity about ultimate matters enabled us to engage in political tolerance. In short, then, a polarized religious situation in Lutheranism led to a division that separated the progressives from the Orthodox. I'm back now to the conflicted church, the schism. I believe that such a winnowing between the progressives and the Orthodox is going on throughout the world, particularly in the West. But because we could find religious unity, our parish could weather the political polarization handily. We didn't even have to pray for our political enemies because in a Christian point of view, they were our brothers and sisters, not enemies. They were Christian friends. I dearly hope others have been able to find the same unity, forbearance, and peace in the polarized political situation. Genuine Christianity should enable people who disagree theologically and politically to respect each other even as they disagree. We're all created in the image of God and redeemed by Christ. That may not mean that we're in the same churches or the same political parties, but it should mean a little less vitriol, a little less conflict, and a little less polarization. Thank you very much.
We've got plenty of time for conversation and discussions. We're going to begin with two members of the St. Olaf Religion Department faculty, Kiara Jorgensen and Anthony Bateza. Kiara, I'll ask the first question. Have a chance for Professor Benne to respond, then Anthony, and then Professor Benne.
Dr. Benne, thank you so much for your timely and provocative remarks. As a young scholar who seeks to do work for the sake of the church, and as one with deep ties to the Lutheran tradition, I just really thank you for your autobiographical remarks, for your commitment to our tradition and to our church, and for the way you seek to connect what you see as the secular cultural upheaval with the life and the doctrines of our church.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for doing that. My primary question relates to your proposed method of relating religion to politics, Christianity to politics. You're clearly arguing from a certain variety of the Lutheran doctrine of two kingdoms, this idea of religion neither being separated nor fused with the political sphere. And in my estimation, you, albeit briefly, rightly suggest that for the Christian to check her own personal beliefs at the door of any polling place is to lack integrity and authenticity, that a Christian would be remiss to do so. But your paper concerns itself less with that temptation, it seems, and more with the what you deem the potentially fatal problem of politicized religion. So I want to ask two questions related to that. You argue that the hostile political polarization within our church can be perhaps avoided and addressed by Christians' critical participation in both of these realms. And in some detail, you speak about how Christianity might address politics and kind of bring these three really important core themes to our attention. I'd like to hear more, though, about how politics, and by politics, I mean by extension, the many disciplines that contribute to the making of political ideologies and histories and policies, how can those things constructively speak to Christian identity and Christian theology? I'm mindful here of Luther's words on how the ever-changing needs of our neighbor, the political changing needs of our neighbor, in effect, to rewrite the Decalogue for us in new ways. Mm-hmm. That idea of vocation. And that relates to my second question. I would love to hear you speak a little bit more about this idea of religious solidarity. And you just, you spoke about how that, you're making a claim about the penultimate being really fundamental there. I love that idea, but as a scholar who spent some time looking at Christian responses to environmental problems, I question whether it's possible. It seems to me that when we're dealing with really controversial issues, like some of the movements you mentioned at the fore of your paper, we can't even agree on what voices to listen to or what actually constitutes a source of authority. So if you'd speak a little more to how do we gain this place of solidarity, and I would love to hear you contextualize that question with regard to one of those movements you spoke about, with regard to environmentalism or another. How do we understand information from, say, the scientific community, social sciences? How do Christians faithfully respond to those other sources?
Good, thank you. It seems to me it's the same question. It's how emergences in the world, politically or scientifically or whatever, affect Christian belief and Christian theological reflection. And of course, I would be foolish to argue that they don't affect one's theological thinking, and that's where my phrase critical engagement comes into play. One of the things I've really pushed hard in my work on Christian higher education is the idea of faith, reason, and engagement. And by faith, I mean the core great tradition of Christian thinking, of the theological tradition and the moral tradition, the Christian intellectual and moral tradition, and that those ought to be engaging with the secular fields in a lively, critical conversation. And that in such a conversation, one takes some risks about what will change you, both conversation partners. And one must be ready to take those risks when one enters such an engagement. And it seems to me you're asking that question: how does political life and cultural movements affect the core Christian beliefs? Well, it seems to me that there's often a good chastening effect that goes from movements from the secular world and political world to some of the Christian distortions that have taken place. And so that I would say, agree that, say, feminism did smell out a lot of patriarchy in the Christian heritage, and that there has to be an engagement with it. It's going to change how we think theologically to some extent, and it's a wholesome kind of environment. So those movements of the 50s, including environmentalism, have been very helpful, it seems to me, in challenging Christian theological thinking. So there's a whole welter of material now on Christian environmentalism. What bothers me a little bit is when number one, when those things become so engaging and mesmerizing to people that they become the center of kind of redemptive power, and the Christian claims to truth about the role of Christ and redemption are kind of sidelined. And you get an emerging ideology from secular sources that not only sometimes claim the secular role, an ultimate role, as we talked about earlier, but you also then get a real risk that you can undermine classic Christian teachings that are kind of settled or part of the great tradition. And that, it seems to me, what happened in the three examples that I gave to you, that feminism was very strong in the seminary that I was teaching at, and there was a lot of good things that happened there. The opening of the ordained ministry to women. But there was also a kind of edge to it that could deny, like the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then so you got to, that's part of the problem, is defining what is the core Christian beliefs that are kind of non-negotiable. You can't really give them away, while you also take seriously the world. So in terms of a biblical worldview, hardly anyone believes anymore in three levels of the cosmos. I mean, there's an open cosmos that we learn about. So that's changed Christian thinking remarkably. So it's a dialogue, it seems, of critical participation in which no one holds a trump card simply because you're a religious authority, nor does the secular world hold a trump card. So that's one of the things that I really think Christian colleges ought to be doing, is that kind of engagement between what wholesome influence as well as evil influences coming from the world, and engaging it with what I would call the great tradition of Christian thinking. Yeah.
Excellent. Let me reiterate my colleagues' praise of what I found to be a wonderful paper, in which, Dr. Benne, you've allowed us to think theologically, and intellectually, and critically about deep personal and political issues with the kind of clarity and authenticity that we need, and the ability to make theological commitments as concrete as possible, taking us through deep issues and texts, but also reminding us of the faces of the people behind these issues in the parish, in our communities, and across our country. Following the model you've set, I want to ask two questions after a little bit of setup. So the first is, I'm concerned with your description of the groups and movements with which you disagree. While you say that the civil rights movement, feminist advocates for gay rights, etc., made important momentary gains, you also say that they burrowed their way into American society. This collective they seem to either be the source of or symptom of many of today's ills in the church. They even go so far as voicing their discontent in ways that push corporations and organizations to respond to social and political issues of our day. You allude to the NCAA and the issues of gender nonconformity in North Carolina bathrooms. Mm-hmm. You might also add Bill O'Reilly as the most recent victim of the they attacking and pushing corporations based on their secular ideologies or agendas. Mm-hmm. So my first question then concerns your characterization of these groups and their motivations. This secular progressive they want to attack religious beliefs and practices. Their goal, you say, is to confine religion. But I ask, is this a charitable reading of these groups and their adherents? Or do you run the risk of ignoring their deeply held commitments? And for their allies within the church, their religious allies, do you overlook their deeply held biblical and theological reasons reasons they might hold to and offer in defense of their positions that aren't reducible to momentum in the culture or to accommodation of larger movements. So, is this a charitable reading? And if not, is it a problem insofar as it spurs on or perhaps encourages the kind of polarization and mischaracterization you yourself are concerned about? My second question also relates to the tone of the narrative you've cast for us. Toward the end of your paper, you say that religious solidarity can permit political tolerance. You seem to lead us towards the conclusion that this religious solidarity needs to come first, and that political tolerance can emerge once we've agreed on some core Christian convictions that themselves are unalterable and can't be changed. Along with this narrative, along one track, there's a certain sorrow and I would say a certain wistfulness to the story that you tell. You and your wife experience pain, being in some ways feeling like as if you were forced out of a church into which you were born. And there's a certain looking backwards over one's shoulder towards a simpler time when Elvis ruled the radio waves, or not Sinatra ruled and not Elvis. Get that right. So on one side, there's this wistfulness towards a time gone past, one that I think resonates with a lot of the folks who supported Trump and who supported certain populist movements, an attempt to make America great again or make the church great again. So we need to get back to this time of smooth sailing, of agreed upon music, and then we can move on to having political tolerance and trust. But I also see a second narrative or a second trajectory in your paper. In this one, you don't point towards smoothness or agreement, but you point toward a collection of virtues shared by people in your congregation, people you interact with, that allows them to have trust, patience, forbearance, and ultimately tolerance of difference. So I wonder, do we need a return to this wistful time of smooth agreement to achieve tolerance? Or perhaps are there virtues embedded in congregations, virtues we might share with our secular neighbors, virtues we might share with people in the world that allow tolerance to rule without religious conformity being the norm?
Well, taking the latter one first, I don't hope that for any kind of renewal of that unusual time, post-war time. Most people agree that there was an unusual kind of coherence in that era. You can't go back again, and history will keep moving, it seems to me. But it seems to me that there is a real danger of falling apart in this country, polarization, and the descent of working classes into drugs and chaos, and the black community's problem with marriage and family culture. All of these things are really worrisome to me. And I don't expect any retrieval of the 50s to settle that or to pull it all back together. I really don't. But, you know, America's been a country of religious revivals. And one of the 18th century of Jonathan Edwards, the First Great Awakening, had enormous influence on American life. The Second Great Awakening got very excited and interested in it because that's when Roanoke College was birthed. And the founder of the college was a raging evangelical. He was sociologically a Lutheran, but he wasn't a Lutheran theologically. And the chutzpah they had to what they called a Christianized society, they proliferated all these voluntary associations, they founded colleges. And something grand came out of that. Just like in the Revolutionary War, I mean, not the Civil War period. Anyway, I pray every day for a renewal, a revival of Christianity in America, and it's going to be different. It's probably going to have to be through the electronic means, which I have no clue how that will emerge. But I pray every day because I believe our country is in some serious condition that only deep cultural renewal is going to renew. And one of my favorite writers, Rusty Reno of First Things, talk about the loosening of everything. There aren't any strong teachings anymore, loose, and we're falling into the concerns for health, wealth, and good food. You know, it's kind of a descent. And so I really do pray, and that's not going to be the 50s, it's going to be something new, I hope. And I really pray that we do have something like that. And the church rises up. The Holy Spirit does that work. So I don't expect that kind of national narrative to come through that's going to look like the 50s. I do believe that with Dreyer's Benedict option, that in a culture that's falling apart and in many ways descending, that the church really does need a more disciplined life. More catechesis, good catechesis, more training in the Christian life, probably more Christian schools that are seriously Christian. In our part of the country, homeschooling is a big deal. People believe that the culture is descending and they really need to get their act together as Christians. Now, he is an Orthodox guy, and Catholics talk about the same thing. They don't, Reno doesn't talk about withdrawing, but there is a sense in which we're fraying, that Christianity is fraying at the edges, and that the casual Christians are departing, and it's time to deepen and strengthen the Christian roots. And I don't see how you can do that without some sense of core Christian teachings. Creedal Christianity, you might call it the great tradition. Lutheran confessions are a great place to start for the Lutheran tradition to get that more deeply into the leadership of the church and so on. So I think there has to be a solidarity. And I proposed, I was intrigued by the fact that we could be so candid about political differences that often get people really angry in that class. And the only way I could account for that is that we were on the same page theologically, and I had warned them about the complexity of moving from that theological page to political decisions. So it's an intriguing idea to me that more serious religious engagement and solidarity will lead to more tolerance of politics, less polarization in politics. It was already talked about this essay by Peter Beinart, and it was a kind of a revelation to me in which he says that the descending religious participation of both the secular progressive class as well as the white working class has led to identity politics on the one side and nationalist, racist identity politics on the other side. And he submits that this is simply the lack of social capital. People aren't engaging each other. But I think it has to do with the loss of this consensus on basic religious or Christian affirmations. That's what Now, your first one is, you're probably right. It's an uncharitable reading of some of these movements in the 60s because I lived through them and in fact was caught up in them. And I had my own liberal and radical period until I thought the excesses of the 60s became so excessive that I couldn't go there. And I went into the dean one day and said, I can't be the House radical anymore because I don't believe it. And I said, I'm going to start calling them as I see them, and you're going to hear me argue unusual things, strange things. Now, let me give you a good example. I was deeply involved in the civil rights movement. King came to Chicago, started Operation Breadbasket. I listened to black preachers every Saturday morning, large number of black preachers and black actors in Chicago. And the whole point of it, guess who was leading it? King selected Jesse Jackson to be the leader of that. And we marched to Cicero, bad choice to march to a white working class area where their whole lives are wrapped up in their houses. But anyway, all of that. And then, with a very sharp turn, it becomes black power. And the seminary I was teaching at, we had great cooperation with Operation Breadbasket. When black power comes along, Jesse Jackson kicks all the whites out of the organization, and you began getting real violence-prone pressure, and finally a sharp disengagement with the Christian tradition that the civil rights movement had. And so I probably am more on all those scores, probably a little bit more uncharitable than I should be. What bothered me finally the deepest is that they finally, what I thought, undermined Christian teachings, Orthodox Christian teachings. And feminism in its own, a certain kind of feminism, undergirded the pro-life tradition of the Christian church. So as I said, the ELCA couldn't find anything to advocate for along those lines. And that's really disheartening to me. And the other one is the Great Commission, so honed on anti-colonialism that we gave up pioneer evangelism and orphaned a whole bunch of Lutheran societies that were doing pioneer evangelism because we thought it was so contaminated. And then, of course, I just fundamentally believe that the Christian teaching on marriage is as clear as can be, and that you have to hold to those teachings. That's not a second order thing. Well, that's right in the hand. So that's probably why I'm less charitable than I should be, and you raise a good point.
You have time for one or two additional questions. Chuck, in the back, if we could get a person away. My apologies.
Yeah, when it's red, it's on.
Now it's on. I teach in the psychology department here, and occasionally I go to churches in the area because I'm asked to talk about what we know and don't know about homosexuality, as churches are struggling with doctrine in this area. One of the things that I have noticed as I speak both at churches but also with some of my scientific colleagues is the prevalence of motivated reasoning. That our doctrine tells us something or our social commitments tell us something, and we use those things in order to decide that something in the research must be wrong. And so then we go in and look for what might be wrong with the study. Sometimes that's helpful because sometimes there are things. But sometimes what it does is it ends up obscuring the possibility for people to engage in charity with the truth of people's experience. And so I'm wondering, as a Lutheran theologian, what resources you could bring to me from Lutheran theology to help us detect and work against this kind of motivated reasoning.
Give me an example of motivated reading. Don't quite understand.
Sure.
Yeah.
One of the pretty clear results that comes out of the research in homosexuality is that if you would like for science to help you figure out how to raise your child so that they would have a particular sexual orientation, you're out of luck. Because all of the theories that people have brought about science, about the ways that people become homosexual, end up being wrong. And what we're finding out is that these things come into the consciousness of children really quite early, and it does not feel to them like it is their own choice, but it is their discovery about who they are. And so this is the experience of people that I then find people with particular doctrine about marriage who say, there must be something wrong with those studies. And so we will go in and look for what's wrong with them. I could also give you an example from people who really would like to find a genetic cause for homosexuality in order to claim that it's absolutely the case that there is, and there's motivated reasoning on that side in order to be able to claim that really there absolutely is nothing about one's upbringing. And so you find people from different sides taking the same data and trying to fit it back into their doctrinal positions. And so my question is, what is there in your theological tradition that can help us be aware of when we're doing that?
Well, it seems to me that as Mitri Rahib argued, that there is an interest involved in inquiry. That's kind of what you're saying too, right? There's a motivation and interest involved in inquiry. Well, I am certainly no expert on the psychosomatic or psychosexual dynamics of homosexuality. And as far as my reading goes, is as you suggested, it's pretty mysterious yet what happens in that. And I'm not terribly interested in that, is in the kind of doctrinal position that I'm advancing. I've done years and years of study on the Christian teaching on marriage, and for that teaching, it is unthinkable that a man could marry a man. The texts are clear in the Bible. The tradition is clear in Christian teaching throughout the ages. The Jewish tradition is clear on that beforehand. And all the way up into the present, until the 60s or 80s or 90s, no one ever thought about that. So it seems to me it's one of the pressures coming from the culture that probably need to be resisted by Christians. In fact, I resist it. And that's not a very happy position to take in colleges and universities these days. Secular progressives are pretty much dominant in universities, so it's very unpopular to take that classic Christian teaching. So I think there's a lot of good things that have come out of the gay and lesbian movement. One of them, that we treat gay and lesbians fully as human beings, but that doesn't mean that we Christians can embrace marriage for gay and lesbians.
One more. This will be. Can you use this one? This will be a kind of a short one. I'm a United Methodist pastor, retired, happily, having spent 17 years in college and university campuses as a campus minister, very much through the 50s and 60s, and lived through that transformation and took stances and watched all these movements you're talking about develop. Now in the United Methodist Church, I wonder if you're familiar with the struggle we're going through. We now have a commission for a way forward, trying to preserve the unity of our church, whatever that word means, uniformity, unanimity, anyhow. And then we have a Wesleyan, I don't know if I got the right word, Wesleyan Covenant Association, which sounds very much like what you're doing. It's sort of, these are the orthodox positions, the Wesley positions, but they're orthodox positions, and we're going to cling to those, and we insist that the Commission on a Way Forward, established by the bishops, by the way, with the General Conference, our global decider every 4 years, agreeing to, we've told them which way it's going to go, the Wesleyan movement says, and if it doesn't, we'll see what happens. But in effectively, they've already created structures, which would be alternate structures if it doesn't go their way. Is that similar to the struggle you're in, and would you maybe advocate that the church should split rather than, even if the bishops want to hold it together, even the bishops in Africa, particularly Philippines, Europe, want to hold it together?
Yeah. Well, as I understand, the Methodist challenge is that because you have a World Methodist Conference that has to agree on things, that the classic Christian teachings are holding and probably will hold, since Methodists are increasing a lot more in Africa and other places than here. So American Methodists are becoming a smaller unit relative to the larger one. It seems to me what's going to be fascinating is that there will be a split from the left in Methodism, that there will be a church split, and that the Americans will move toward the marriage of gays and lesbians and the acceptance of partnered gays and lesbians in their parishes. That's what's going to happen. Would you agree that that's probably what's going to happen?
Well, it's our bishop here in Minnesota that is operating this whole thing, Bishop O. So he's doing his darndest to hold it all together.
Yeah.
The commission they've learned to trust each other, which is part of what you're talking about in your church group, disagree and trust each other. They may come up with some loosening, is the word they're using, some loosening that will allow us to keep a global structure. So I'm not ready to throw the whole thing out, though many of my colleagues, like the present campus minister at the University of Minnesota, where I was for 11 years, he says it's over with. We're splitting. We'll see what happens to individual congregations, individual regional bodies, and global bodies, but that's where it's going. So I'm still hanging slightly to the possibility something will be worked out. You see, we've been a very diverse church. I think we've been more diverse than, say, the general Lutheran church in America. Not to use the ELCA language.
Well, good luck. I hope you hold together. Thank you. Well, you're welcome.